Hello and welcome to our weekly edition of Tuesday Temple Takeaway. Thank you for taking the time to join me. Last week we embarked on a new series called One Thing, and we'll be looking over 5 weeks at the little phrase one thing. Last week we looked at the example of the rich young ruler, and where he had a conversation with Jesus, and Jesus said to him, one thing you lack. And today we're going to look at the story of Jesus visiting the home of Mary and Martha. And it's a home that he loved to retire to. He was a family friend of Mary and Martha, close friends with the family. He enjoyed visiting their home. It was a convenient place for him to go and rest and just pull away from the crowds, and it was almost like an oasis of peace for him. And the incident that we're going to look at is found in Luke chapter 10 and verse 38 through to 42. And Jesus arrives there, and the text says that he arrives with his disciples. And Mary and Martha, of course, had two sisters who had different priorities. Their way of making Jesus feel at home couldn't have been more different. And Jesus arrives with his team, and Martha immediately gets down to business. She doesn't waste any time in preparing the meal. She's very pragmatic. She wants to be as hospitable as she can, and she goes about her business. She's diligent and domesticated, and there was 13 men turned up for supper, so it was quite a task. There was a lot of work to be done, and she's being a responsible hostess. Mary, on the other hand, is completely opposite to what Martha is doing. Mary is sat at the feet of Jesus, and she wasn't going to give up this opportunity of sitting and listening to the wonderful words that would have come from the mouth of Jesus. So Martha is on her feet, and Mary is sat at his feet, listening and embracing everything that Jesus has to say. And to start with, this arrangement seemed to be okay. Martha was busy preparing the meal, and Mary was in the other room, and with the others, just listening to the wonderful teachings and the wise counsel from Jesus. And Mary would have been hanging on to his every word. She would have been resting and drawing in the living water that came from the words of Jesus, from the very presence. Having Jesus in the house itself was an amazing thing. But Martha, on the other hand, is busy working away, but slowly but surely she begins to get restless and stressed and frustrated. And she's desperate for another pair of hands in the kitchen. And the logical helper, of course, would have been her sister. But she's otherwise engaged. She's sat in another room. She seems to be oblivious to what's actually happening in the kitchen and the demands that are on Martha to cook supper for so many people. The weight and the responsibility of this entire dinner is on the shoulders of Martha. And she's ticking away. She's inwardly fuming. And as we know, it suddenly just boils over. There's an outburst of frustration. And she interrupts the conversation and says to Jesus, "Don't you care that my sister has left me to do everything in the kitchen myself?" And it's one moment of anger, but she blames two people, and she blames Jesus, and surely it's not his fault. And she blames Mary as well. And so it's a bit of a meltdown that she has. And of course, she's trying to get at her sister through Jesus, because you notice Martha doesn't even address the problem to Mary. She doesn't sort of call Mary out of the room and privately has a word with her. But her concern, her frustration, her stress is directed at Jesus, and Mary is sat in the room. And, you know, even in church settings, I've seen people just lose the plot and have a bit of a meltdown if they've been left maybe in the kitchen, or they've been left to do something and other people are just stood around talking, or, you know, they're engaged in other activities, and it all gets a bit too much for some people. And several times I've had to go and intervene. I've had to go and just calm things down, because people do tend to boil over if they've been left to do things and without any help. And people are always ready to say, well, I did it on my own without any help. And but Martha's desire was to be a superb hostess. But of course that came at a price, because doing all she had to do with diligence meant much anxiety for her and much stress. She's trying to control the situation. She's delighted that Jesus has come for supper, no doubt about that. She doesn't resent him in any way. But it's the putting together of the meal all on our own, and our sister choosing another route. So, you know, what begins as a serving experience becomes a self-serving one for her. And in the meal was not about Martha. The meal was to honour Jesus. Martha was simply preparing it, but the meal was to honour Jesus. So the outburst comes, and Jesus feels that he has to deal with it. And he, as you can imagine, he handles it very well. He handles it with real tenderness and sensitivity. He repeats her name twice, Martha, Martha, as if to reassure her that she's important. She's no less important than Mary. She's of great value to him. She's a family friend that has been loyal to him. And he says to her, Martha, you've been distracted by many things. You've been worried, you're anxious, you feel neglected, Martha. And then he says something very pointed to her. He says, but one thing is needful. He says, Martha, you were so busy serving me that you have given me no time to speak into your life. Why don't you come and sit where Mary sat, and I can share something with you. I can speak into your life. That's the missing ingredient. Your motives are good, but your heart seems to be divided. You know, there are many things that overwhelmed Martha, but one thing really mattered. And that was intimacy with Jesus. That was taking time to listen to him. And in our own life, there are times that we decide to take on things because we consider them to be hugely important and urgent, perhaps, but they can crowd out what really is God's will for our life. And because the Bible said we should seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these other things will be added to us. So what we deem as important sometimes can actually crowd out an important moment that we lose, perhaps, with knowing Jesus more and developing greater relationship with him. You see, no amount of service for Christ can substitute from having the value of taking time to be with, to spend time with him. You know, we all want to work for Jesus, but, you know, we must worship him first. Worship comes before work, and spending time with Jesus, listening to him, allowing his Spirit to speak to us, makes our work all the more effective. Sometimes we're working out of empty because our relationship with Jesus, you know, it's plummeted, but we're still working away. But we need to restore the worship factor, the intimacy, the relationship building with Jesus. And let's not allow the distraction of something that's secondary to keep you from developing a rich, vibrant relationship with Jesus. Jesus said, Mary has chosen the better part. She's chosen that of eternal value. She has seen the value of fellowship, of coming close. And sometimes, you know, we can easily fall into the trap of thinking that, you know, what we do for God is more important than what we are, and or that being with God, we're being with Jesus. But God calls us, to intimacy, and our identity and our intimacy are linked very closely. And Jesus said the Father seeks those that will worship him. And so while there's work to be done, and there'll always be work to be done in the kingdom, in the church, but let's not forget that before we work for God, we must worship him. And we must cultivate a relationship of intimacy and closeness. And out of that greater love for him, then we will offer far more effective service to him. So thank you for joining me this morning on this series of One Thing. And next week we'll be looking at the blind man in John chapter 9, and whose cry was, "One thing I do know, once I was blind, but now I see." The Lord bless you. Bye-bye.